Thank you very much for this invitation to come and speak to you. It feels like a real honour and a privilege to be here, and I've learnt an enormous amount already. I know from talking to Julian last week, he was very disappointed that he wasn't able to come over, but for me it's been a real gain. So just to say, I'm a full-time editor working at Cochrane. I want to thank the colleagues that helped me put these slides together. And I'm aware that some of you will be familiar with Cochrane and some won't, so I'll just very briefly talk about Cochrane. We are an international community of 37,000 people or so actively involved, spreading across 120 countries. And our mission is primarily to inform evidence-based decision-making by the production and publication of high-quality systematic reviews. And those reviews are published in the Cochrane Library, which is on the slide. And currently we have just over 7,000 active reviews and around 2,000 protocols. And we publish around 1,000 new or updated reviews a year. And if you do a search on the Cochrane Library for traumatic brain injury, you find around 46 active systematic reviews. And since we also hold the central register for trials, you can also find around 2,000 studies, many of which, but not all, will be trials. So this is the blueprint published from a 2011 Institute of Medicine document around the relationship between systematic reviews and guidelines. And as you can see, on the top left of the slide, the process starts with a group of people getting together to identify a need and to think about what evidence and guidance is needed. And this then spreads across to the right-hand top of the slide, leading to a series of systematic reviews, classically by multidisciplinary teams who produce a report, and that goes to the guidelines bodies, and the guidelines bodies characteristically think about the evidence, but they also think about the population's values and preferences and the expertise of these experts and so on, and come up with some guidelines and recommendations, and therefore improve the care of patients. It's a good graphic, but it's not entirely working. Maybe it's not quite up to date. And increasingly there are concerns about evidence, its validity and applicability to clinical care. Characteristically, people want answers much more quickly. Systematic reviews take a time to produce, and frequently bodies are sitting around waiting, can't sit around waiting for the evidence to be produced. So that's a problem. There's an increasing interest in different forms of evidence, evidence from non-randomized studies, different types of questions, real-world data, such as we were hearing about in the earlier presentation. More complex, versatile evidence, not just looking at drugs versus other drugs, but looking at how care is presented, and so on. And of course, and again it came up this morning, people thinking increasingly not about populations, but about individualized or personalized care and how we make use of the evidence to create that. So I'm going to just mention 3 potential sources of help. So the first is technology, and technology is beginning to play a very important part in the generation of evidence. And on this slide, I'm showing one example, but there are many others. This is from our pipeline project, and one of the challenges we face is identifying all the relevant evidence. And it takes people a long time. But we now have found that you can use machines to look at large numbers of studies and papers and make sensible judgments about whether they are or they're not randomized trials, and indeed can pick out the essential elements of those trials, such as the PICO data, the populations, interventions, comparisons, and outcomes. And we found that identifying trials, we can achieve well over 99% accuracy, and we're getting better at the others. And this can really help us speed up the process. And the other thing that we've found is by using the crowd, we can refine it further. And it's been a surprise to me, but nonetheless, what we've found is that there are lots of people out there who are very keen to help us to identify studies. And so our Cochrane Crowd database has just under 7,000 current contributors from 118 countries. And they've actually managed to classify almost 1.5 million studies as being either a study or not a study. And if you combine that with the technology, you may not be able to see at the top of the slide, the technology saying this particular study is 91% likely to be a trial. You combine the technology and the crowd, you can really reach probably better levels of accuracy much, much faster through using that than the conventional methods. So help number 2, and this is always a risk of being controversial, is grade. I'm sure that you will have considered the use of grade for your guidelines, and you may have strong views about that, but I just want to say from a personal perspective why I think grade is really useful. Firstly, it's because for looking at the quality of a body of evidence, it looks at the outcomes rather than the studies. That seems to me, from the outset, to be very much more useful. It's intuitive, it's flexible. I won't go into the details of the methods because we'd be here all day. But for me, it's a great link, a bridge between the evidence and the guidelines. It forces you to consider harm. It forces you to think about relative and absolute effect differences. It forces you to think about how certain you are in your answers. It helps you improve the narrative. It stops you relying on outdated factors such as, is this statistically significant or not, for deciding whether a treatment's effective or not. And here is a summary of findings tables. I find these really easy to look at, but I understand that when you look at them for the first time, it doesn't seem that way. But what you have here is a list of important outcomes down the first and left-hand column, and as you trace them across the column, you can see there the relative and absolute differences and the certainty of evidence presented to you. So you get a very clear idea, is for these benefits and for harms, what's the likelihood of these benefits and these harms happening in the populations in the studies. And now over 100 organizations, many of them research organizations, but also WHO, journals such as the BMJ have adopted grade. So help number 3 is through living systematic reviews. I talked at the beginning about systematic reviews taking too long to conduct. And what we're doing, and a group of people outside Cochrane are also doing, is trying to think about how we develop living systematic reviews that really do respond as new data becomes available, continuously updated. And what you do is you start off by getting a review up to date, and then you commit over time to use technology, use the crowd, use the author teams to incorporate new data as it becomes available. But now to move from evidence to guidelines. And I think there's been some really good work done, EU-funded, the DECIDE project, that helped to try and work out how the evidence links to decision-making and recommendations. And the evidence to decision tables came out of this work. What we look at here are answering specific questions, such as how substantial are the desirable and undesirable effects? What's the certainty of those effects? Do the desirable effects likely outweigh the undesirable effects? What are the cost implications? What would be the impact on health equity, on acceptability to the end users, and feasibility? All of which sets you up to be able to create the guideline and create the recommendations. And what you come out with as an output are either strong recommendations to give an intervention or to withhold it, or conditional or recommendations where you say, well, in some cases you might do this, but in some cases you might decide not to. So living guidelines are a similar process to living systematic reviews in a sense. You develop the base guideline, perhaps the guidelines you've got in front of you, and then as soon as the guidelines are produced, you switch to a living mode. recognizing that the unit of the update is the recommendation. You might not necessarily want to update the entire guideline every year or keep it up to date, but if the evidence changes or something societally changes that may affect values and preferences, you can update a recommendation in a sort of living, real-time way. But to have living guidelines, you need quite a lot of things in place. You need the systematic reviews to be living, the evidence profiles, the panels to be available, peer review. If you're going to publish, you need to have a publication process, and you need coordination and budget. So it's not a minor undertaking at all. But again, we are helped by technology, and technology is helping with generating evidence, but it's also helping us with creating guidelines. And I'm just mentioning here the Magic app, which some of you will have come across, built in Norway, which is an authoring and publication platform which aims to use the evidence and the grade evidence profiles to help people create recommendations. And just to show it's possible, I think some of you will be aware, I'm sorry in the room of the Lancet to mention the BMJ, but it's where I come from. But the BMJ series, rapid recommendations, that they're using the Magic tool, a collaboration between McMaster, BMJ, and the Magic people, and in this case, looking at surgery for degenerative knee disease and trying to create a system that works to really update recommendations in a sort of real-time, living way. So just to conclude, these are really changing times for evidence-based guidelines. I think some of the old ways of doing things are wearing out, and we need to be updated. Much of that updating requires us to really exploit the technology that's available, and also novel methods of involvement, such as crowds. That leads to different forms of authorship. Do you allow the crowd members to be authors of your paper? And that living systematic reviews can really provide evidence to inform living guidelines. Thank you very much.